Vi. Mars was wholesome in death before the coming of the spacemen. Now it was the refuse heap of the solar system. There was Heliopolis, of course, the great, shining, chrome-plated spaceport where vessels from all parts of the system touched for refueling and recreation of the passengers. Recreation that was not legal on any of the other planets. The permanent population of Heliopolis was 3/4 confidence men. The other fourth was made up of fugitives from penal colonies and thieves and murderers whose crimes had not caught up with them. But these were the elite of the population of Mars. The lower types were found in the 5 suburbs surrounding Heliopolis. The worst of the 5 was Taurus, where daily morning chores was burial of those who had been unfortunate in the night's tavern brawls. As the Corsair approached the red planet, Nathan wondered where the incomprehensible Firebird fit into this wild and evil city. But she claimed it for home. Regarding the miracle of Lulin, she had refused to say a word, and his repeated inquiries only forced her to greater reticence and widened the gap between them until he was forced to give up. It was night on that side of Mars when they dropped the Corsair onto the crowded field at the edge of Taurus. Amid the other vessels, the ship stood like a jewel in a handful of gravel. There was always a pause in the activities of the field when the ship of the Firebird came in. Attendants straightened up to stare, and wizened, space-burned adventurers paused when Firebird strode out of the port. She went down the ramp as if she were making a grand entrance into a ballroom. 1,000 eyes were upon her, from corners of the field, from shops and all-night eateries, and from the hulls of silent ships. She was a living legend walking in their midst. She gave instructions for the needed repairs to the Corsair, then the two of them started towards the town only a quarter of a mile away. "What happens next?" said Nathan. "Almost anything, but whatever it is, it will require the use of your flame lance. Keep it handy. There will be a lot of waiting and listening. If you wait long enough, you can hear all the secrets of the innermost chambers of the system revealed right in the taverns of Taurus. Our plan will be to let it be known that we have the 4 jewels and are here for the other 3. There will be happenings enough after that. I'll leave it to you to spread that information." Nathan did not question her further. They had arrived at the garish entrance to the Orbit, a 2-story tavern a little larger than its neighbors. Nathan had heard his father mention the place as the unofficial headquarters of half the brigands on the spaceways. The noise of gambling and of drinking and tavern music poured out upon them as they neared the place beneath the red brilliance of the sign overhead. As Firebird stepped through the door, she threw back the crimson cape and tipped her chin a trifle higher. The tinkle of gambling chips and glasses halted and the babble of noise hushed. Firebird strode towards the bar, unmindful of the stairs. Nathan came more slowly. He heard whispering, first at Firebird, then at himself. His hand stayed close to his flame lances. At the bar, the squat-faced bartender, Lee, was pale and flushed by turns. His mouth gaped at Firebird as she said, "Tequila, please." Lee chattered, "You're supposed to be dead. Somebody seen you. You were dead for sure. And now I'm alive for sure. I don't know what you are talking about, but hurry with that tequila." Lee shook his head as if to clear the vision he had seen. He brought the drink and some of the same for Nathan, who was surprised that the place even served a mild, non-intoxicating drink. Nathan wondered about Lee's remark. How had the rumor of Firebird's death been started? What was its significance? As they picked up their glasses, the babble slowly resumed, but Nathan knew they were still the center of attention. Heavy smoke clouds rolled against the lights like miniature thunderheads. Through it Nathan watched the pale faces of the women who seldom saw daylight, and the bronze-leathered faces of the spacemen. He could see them wondering who he was and if he were with Firebird, for he had not spoken to her since they had come in. Firebird made it clear. She turned abruptly and faced the room. "Folks, I want you to meet Nathan Ormandy. You all knew his father. Timer was killed on Venus and Nathan has come to take his place on the spaceways. Come up and have a drink to the new spaceman, who was as good a man as his father ever was." The music died. The room seemed to freeze. Nathan stared at Firebird. She was smiling as if at some secret joke. The little fool, Nathan thought. She knew this would happen. Even his limited knowledge of their codes told him that much. A big bronze spaceman at the nearest table looked up from his cards. "We don't let women buy our drinks," he said. He turned back to the cards. Nathan swore under his breath. What was Firebird trying to do? But it was his move now. The big spaceman picked up a card from his hand and moved to throw it on the table. The card vanished in midair and flakes of ash fell to the table. He glanced up at Nathan's flame lance carelessly resting against his hip. "Perhaps you would accept an invitation from me," said Nathan slowly. The spaceman eyed him narrowly. "We don't let women buy our drinks," he said. His eyes didn't shift, and Nathan's seemed to flicker only for an instant. But it was long enough for the cards in the spaceman's hand to puff into flame. He dropped them frantically. His face lighted with rage and he half rose from his chair, but he said nothing. Nathan's lance hung in the same position. "I think it would be a good idea for you and me to be friends," said Nathan. "Yeah," said the spaceman, "it could be a good idea at that." He rose and stepped slowly to the bar. "Straight scotch for mine," he told Lee. He turned to the rest of the crowd. "Come on up, folks. My friend here is buying us drinks." The hubbub resumed slowly as the crowd followed his leadership to the bar. The spaceman edged close to Nathan. "Name's Tompkins," he said. "Kind of taking after your old man, I see. Hanging around with the Firebird, I mean. I knew Timer pretty well when he was trailing her skirts. Kind of always figured that he did the trigger work and she got the reputation." His loud drawl drew the other spacemen in a ring that was growing tighter about Nathan. It was an old move. "Please don't crowd," said Nathan. "There isn't room at the bar for everybody, but there is plenty of drink." The men glanced at Tompkins. "Sure. Don't crowd," said Tompkins. "The boy's a little trigger nervous tonight. Maybe going to do your first job for Firebird, huh? Does she allow you gambling and drinking money?" Nathan lifted his glass slowly and studied Tompkins and the men above him. He could feel the unplumbed depths of emotion that was being turned upon him. Then he got it. It was their pent-up resentment and hatred of Firebird. They would not have dared bait her like this. It would have led to shooting, and none of them wanted to be known as her killer. Their own peculiar codes were responsible for this. Dueling with Firebird would be open admission that she was their equal. She was perfectly safe in the tavern full of thieves and killers who would have welcomed news of her death at the hand of someone else. Nathan felt like laughing at himself for considering himself something of a noble protector as he had entered the orbit behind Firebird. In reality, she was safe, but the spaceman didn't mean for him to be alive when he left. "You've got me all wrong, gentlemen," said Nathan. "I think Firebird killed my father and I'm stringing along to keep tabs on her. And we have a little agreement that might interest you. Between us we have 4 of the 7 jewels of CHAMAR." Instantly, the smirking, taunting grins became frozen deadliness. The circle pressed inward. "I wouldn't come any closer," Nathan advised. 4 of the 7. Exclaimed Tompkins. "I think you're a liar." "We'll take care of that later," said Nathan. "We've come to get the other 3. Then we'll settle who is to keep them, as well as the matter of my father's murder. I mention it because I thought some of you gentlemen might help us. In fact, you might have 1 or more of the jewels right here in this room. We'll be glad to relieve you of them." There was a dangerous trick with the flame lance that Nathan had learned from his father. The flame could be made to reflect from a wooden surface if the angle of incidence and the intensity of the beam were just right. Nathan had watched the play building up in the circle about him. It was almost ready to go. Behind Tompkins, one of the spacemen had carefully drawn his flame lance. Nathan knew it by the slow movement of the man's shoulders and his attempts to keep his eyes carelessly forward. Tompkins was keeping close against the man, one arm on the edge of the bar. In a moment the point of the lance would appear at Tompkins' waist and blast, as soon as Nathan's attention was turned away from Tompkins. Carefully, Nathan weighed his chances. He had about a 50-50 chance of coming out alive. He wondered just why Firebird had devised such a trap. Right now she was sitting alone at a table on the opposite side of the room, apparently not paying any attention to what was going on. He gauged his distance from the killer and moved a step closer to Tompkins while draining his glass. Then he swung suddenly away, turning his back on Tompkins. In the faces of the men surrounding him he could see the sudden change of expression, which they could not hide. He called the bartender. "Fill up again, Lee. All around. I feel lucky tonight." Simultaneously, his hand dropped carelessly to his side and twisted the pocket of his flame lance to point the electrode behind him. His little finger locked around the trigger and pressed. A sharp scream arose from behind Tompkins and a flame lance clattered to the floor. Nathan whirled. Both his lances were in front of him when he faced Tompkins. But Tompkins was staring down at the dead killer. And he was searching frantically for the source of the shot. Then his glance fell on the charred wood of the front of the bar where Nathan's reflection shot had turned. At first his unbelief was amusing. Then anger came like a hurricane across his face. The spacemen were hungry for a brawl. A hunching of Tompkins' shoulders would send them rushing. Nathan could kill perhaps a dozen before they got him. But there would be little satisfaction in that. He said quietly, "I'll get you first, Tompkins. Better call off your dogs." Tompkins hesitated. If he gave the signal, Nathan would kill him first. If he failed to give it, some drunk spaceman's shot might easily find his back. Then a bellowing interruption solved Tompkins' problem for him. A newcomer burst into the tavern and grasped the scene. He laughed with a gentle thunder. "Oh, I come to look for the son of Timer and find him holding up the brawlingest joint on all Mars, including my old friend Trigger Tompkins." Nathan glanced out of the corner of his eye as Tabor strode forward. 7. Tabor pushed his way into the crowd and the men backed away to return to their tables. The mob urge was broken. "Put up your guns, Nathan. Can't you see that old Tom here is just having a little fun? Why, he wouldn't hurt a fly." Nathan smiled thinly. "I hope the gentleman on the floor wasn't having a little fun, too. I'm afraid he won't be able to have it now." Tompkins said sourly, "I thought you said Firebird and this young fool had been killed on the way here." Tabor shrugged his shoulders. "That's the way news is here in these parts of the system. Nothing reliable. Everybody's liars." He turned to Nathan. "There was some report about you and Firebird having gotten into trouble and I guess the story got exaggerated. I'm plenty glad to see you safe. I came in the Sunbeam to take you back to Venus." "How did you know I was here?" "The Corsair was seen leaving. I knew you'd be aboard." "Why?" Tabor shrugged. "I saw how Firebird twisted your father around her little finger until he got wise. I knew you'd never be able to kill her or resist her. She's a witch. Stay aboard the Sunbeam tonight and we'll start back for Venus in the morning." "I'm not going back. I'm staying aboard the Corsair." Tabor's face darkened. "Your father warned you, son. She's poison. Already you are convinced that she didn't kill him, but it'll always be my personal opinion that she is the one who shot Timer. I believe so, too, but she has offered to help me find out who did. I'm seeing it through to find out what she knows. She's a liar and a thief. She'll get the 2 jewels your father left you and do the same to you as she did to him." Nathan knew that seemed the obvious conclusion, but it wasn't reasonable in the face of things he had seen. There was something more that was far from obvious. There was the mystery of Firebird herself and the magic pool of Lulin. And the mystery of the jewels themselves. "I'll find out my own way," said Nathan. Tabor's face broke with a deep laugh then. "I might have known what your answer would be. In a lifetime of argument with Timer I never won yet. I see I'm going to do the same with you. Let's drink. You and Firebird come aboard the Sunbeam for tonight. I'll leave for Venus in the morning and wait for you to come back, which won't be long, I'm predicting." Nathan went over to the table where Firebird still seemed to ignore her surroundings. But there was admiration in her eyes. "That was nice handling," she said. I knew you could do it. It could have been done without shooting, said Nathan. You don't know the orbit, Firebird replied with a smile. No man sets foot in here for the first time without being tried by gunfire. I gave you the best possible opening. You took it like a veteran of the spaceways. They'll respect you. Now, Tabor wants us to come aboard the Sunbeam for tonight. He's leaving for Venus in the morning and wants me to go back, but I told him that I wouldn't. Rather curious, that rumor about our being killed on the way here, said Firebird. Possibly the Black Warrior was in communication with someone just before the battle and gave word that he was closing in on us. Possibly, Firebird's eyes were gazing across the room towards Tabor. I'll go aboard the Sunbeam on one condition, she said. What's that? Let me have your 2 jewels in my possession while we are aboard. I'll return them in the morning. Nathan looked at her, trying to fathom her motives, wondering why he trusted her, why he wanted to trust her. Why? The jewels are synchro-responsive, said Firebird. When several of them are together they indicate the near presence of another one by becoming warm. The more there are together, the warmer they become. When the nearby jewel is very close the effect disappears. I don't see. Tabor has one of the jewels, I'm sure. The pink one. But that's the one that was stolen. That would mean. Exactly. How do you suppose he obtained the mistaken idea that we were dead? I'll tell you how it was. He tipped off the Black Warrior who attacked us in space. Tabor didn't dare do it himself, but he left it for the other killer to do. Then Tabor planned to take our 4 jewels from our attacker. That's why he came here, to look for the man. He came to take me back. Nonsense. That's a tale he thought up on the spur of the moment when he found that we were victorious in the space battle. Nathan frowned. The story was logical even if it wasn't reasonable. But Firebird had no proof. Unless she could prove Tabor had the pink jewel. Carefully concealing his emotions from the crowd in the tavern, Nathan unlocked the bell container of the jewels and handed them over to Firebird. Tabor's waiting, he said. For Tabor, Firebird donned another cloak of personality, revealing still another facet of herself to bewilder Nathan. She taunted and baited Tabor as if trying to rouse his anger. But the shaggy spaceman seemed to be in a mood that would not be ruffled by Firebird's taunts. Aboard the ship, they entered the tiny lounge cabin. I've got frozen Gruyere steak direct from Venus, Tabor said. How does that sound? Okay, said Nathan. Then I'll show you how a master cook of the spaceways prepares it. He disappeared into the galley. Nathan watched Firebird. Her eyes darted about the walls of the cabin as if searching every panel and joint. She edged closer to Nathan on the narrow lounge seat. When Tabor was out of sight around the corner of the corridor, she took Nathan's hand and pressed it against the pouch where she had the 4 jewels. The pouch was almost too hot to touch. Questions piled upon his lips. Firebird smiled without speaking. But we don't know the color of it, said Nathan. Right. We don't know the color of it, except that it's either blue or pink. We'll find out soon enough, said Nathan. He rose from the seat, his lips pressed tightly. No. Firebird grasped his arm. We don't need to do that. We'll let him bring it to us when we need it. There's no danger of his going to Venus, now. What do you mean? Nathan sat down reluctantly. We'll head for the Pater Mountains where the 7th jewel is buried. You did a good job of letting it be known what we were here for. When we start buying equipment the word will get around that we are going for the 7th jewel. You can be sure that Tabor will be there, and so will the holder of the remaining jewel. We'll have the 7 then. They'll be ours for the taking. Nathan nodded. Perhaps you are right. It would be easier to force Tabor to tip his hand out there than here in Taurus. The next morning they said goodbye to Tabor and watched the sunbeam lift into the Martian sky. For a moment Nathan wondered if they were right. If Tabor should actually be heading for Venus. Since the Corsair was being repaired they had a logical reason for preparing to go to the Pater Mountains by sand sled, besides the secret purpose of making it easy to trail them. They made elaborate preparations. They visited every supply store in the 5 cities, pricing and examining sand sleds and boldly discussing their reason for wanting one. By the time their equipment was assembled, every spaceman and tourist knew of their purpose and destination. And the word passed to the other towns on Mars as well. It was a late afternoon 2 days later when they left Taurus. Firebird proposed a late start in order to make it easy for anyone to follow them. Since their destination was well known, they anticipated ambush from ahead as well as trailing from behind. Nathan climbed into the narrow seat of the sand sled beside Firebird. She took the wheel because she was familiar with the trail to the mountains. When the transparent cowling was closed over them, they seemed to be in a tiny, separate world all their own. Behind, the muffled roar of the propeller cut the air and mounted in intensity as the sled began to move forward and the runners hissed against the sand. Firebird handled the sled as if any vehicle that traveled slower than a spaceship was much too slow for her. She soon had the sled up to top speed over the level area near Taurus, and soon they were weaving among the giant dunes. The great, shifting dunes of the Martian desert were 40 to 50 feet high. Already the valleys between them were filled with purple shadows and the air was turning cold. The sled dipped and careened. Sometimes it plunged into deep sand valleys and whipped around the curved walls of deep blowholes until it was tipped almost at right angles, clinging only by centrifugal force. Nathan had the impression that Firebird was enjoying it. The treachery of the desert was a challenge to her skillful, daredevil driving. Soon the sun was down and the pale light of the twin moons was deceptive on the sands. Firebird slowed the plunging flight of the sled and drove cautiously then until near midnight. "We should be somewhere near the town of Fem, such as it is," she said. "The last time I saw it, it was almost a ghost town. It may have been completely abandoned by now." "I've never heard of it," said Nathan. In a moment Firebird exclaimed, "There it is. How's that for navigation over this desert?" "Right on the nose." Nathan laughed at Firebird's exuberance over her accuracy. He knew that it was no small job to follow such an unmarked trail across the sands that shifted constantly and made landmarks impossible. When he first saw the town, it looked like only another group of dunes until he saw some of the silhouettes had angular corners. Too angular. Some of the walls he could see sloped crazily. As they came near to the town, it appeared more evident that it was merely abandoned wreckage. There were no lights at all to betray signs of occupation. Slowly, Firebird brought the sled up to the edge of the group of buildings. The floor of the town, which had been laid over the sands to prevent the buildings from being buried or undermined by the winds, was itself covered now with shifting sands, and the walls of some of the structures leaned drunkenly under the heavy burden piled against them. Instead of driving into the town, Firebird turned her lights onto the sand directly in front of the sled and began circling the ruin. "Where are you going?" Nathan asked. "I want to see if there are sled tracks leading into the ruins. Unless they've been waiting for a couple of days, we should be able to forestall any ambush here." They peered ahead as the spot of light moved slowly over the sand. But nowhere did they see the twin ruts marking the path of a sand sled. Suddenly Firebird stopped. "No one would bring a sled up into the town if they wanted to ambush us. They'd know we would look for tracks. They would leave the sled at a distance and come in on sand shoes. And it's almost impossible to track those." "It can be done," Firebird said slowly. "But I don't think we'll have to do it." "Why not?" She placed his hand against the jewel pouch. It was warm with morning heat. "Whoever is here has one of the jewels, and he's not more than 200 feet away," said Firebird. 8. As she spoke, a burst of flame spouted sand in front of their sled. The shower of exploding particles blasted against the cowling. Firebird turned off the light and spun the sled in towards the buildings. She sped into the shadows along what had once been the short main street of Fem. Then they darted into a shadow between two buildings. "There may be more than one of them," said Nathan. The girl shook her head. "Searchers for the 7 jewels do not work in pairs. Not for long, anyway. One of them soon kills the other when they do," she added enigmatically. Nathan glanced at her sharply. wondering if she were reminding him of their own precarious agreement or accusing Tabor. They emerged cautiously from the sled, each gripping one of their flame rifles in addition to the smaller lances. "That shot came from the flat roof building at the end of the street," said Nathan. "We'll get on the roof of this one," said Firebird. "It's a hotel. It's the highest in town. We can fire the other building and get anyone trying to escape." No other shots came their way. Nathan feared their assailant was leaving the building on the corner and trailing them up the street. They entered the old hotel. A foot of sand covered the first floor. The stairs were slippery with it. Shattered windows let the cold night breeze flow through. On the second and third floors they disturbed coveys of sand bats who fluttered and squeaked and poured out the windows in a black cloud. The enemy would certainly know their location now. They came out onto the roof through a broken penthouse store, and in the faint moonlight they had a clear view of the decaying skeleton of the town. The rifles they carried would shoot flames that spread over a great area and tended to hover like flaming corny rather than piercing. Thus, they would be effective in firing the buildings. They took up positions on opposite sides of the roof and sent a dozen shots into the base of the enemy hideout. But they had miscalculated as Nathan had feared. A fusillade of shots came from a roof directly across the street from them and their building burst into torrents of flame. They transferred their fire to the building from which the shots came. The flames hovered and glowed like demons around the base of the structure, but they died like wraiths. "I remember now," said Firebird. "That's the one fireproof building in Fem. It was a special instrument laboratory. We'll have to smoke him out." The tiny orange puffs of a flame lance came steadily from varying points of the other building as if the enemy were running about, pausing only long enough to shoot. The flames from the burning building had already touched off the adjacent structures. The entire ghost town would be ablaze in a short time. Burning brands lit on the roof beside Nathan. They died, but others were coming in a rain of fire. They could see the enemy by the light of the fire now. They fired the buildings on either side and forced him to keep low. But his shots were close and accurate. Nathan and Firebird shifted positions after each shot, but the parapet in front of them was sieved accurately. Then Nathan suddenly realized that the building behind them was aflame and its light silhouetted them against the holes in the parapet. No wonder the enemy could find them. He shouted to Firebird, "Get down." She was too good a flame lancer to be disturbed by his shouting. She remained calmly in position, taking a bead on the opposite window, waiting for the appearance of the top of the enemy's head. He came up for a quick sight upon the perfect target of the holes which Firebird blacked out. They fired simultaneously. Firebird's shot hit the edge of the window, spraying flame over the wall and curling it into the window. Some of it must have washed over the enemy, but too much of its energy had been dissipated to be effective. But Firebird was hit. Her body slumped down over the rifle and lay flat on the roof. Crawling on his belly, Nathan wriggled over to her and raised her head. She was unconscious, but no horrible blackening of her flesh showed the touch of flame lance fire. Then he saw where it had struck. Her silver helmet. It was too hot to touch. He knocked it away with his fist. Beneath it, her raven hair was singed but slightly. The electric shock had done most of the damage. He bent over her tenderly and fanned her face with the edge of her scarlet cloak. She began to stir. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. In that instant he knew that their lives were inseparably welded. No word was spoken, but he felt her trembling as if she suddenly knew it, too, and was afraid of it. After a moment she looked about and spoke, her voice unsteady. "We'll have to get down. The hotel is on fire." Nathan followed the direction of her glance. The open door of the penthouse sent smoke billowing outward. "We'll never get down through the interior," said Nathan. He glanced at the adjacent building. It was 1 story lower and 10 feet away. Firebird saw his glance and shook her head. "We can't get over that way. He'd shoot us the instant we tried it. We'll have to go inside." "But it's impossible." Firebird smiled. "After you've been to the pool of Lulin, many things are possible. Here." She unclasped the cloak from her throat and threw it about Nathan. "Protect your head and wrap it around you as much as possible. It won't burn." Before he could protest, she wriggled away over the surface of the roof, keeping low out of the fire of their assailant. She plunged through the penthouse store into the inferno. The smoke and flame billowed about her, licking at her slender, unprotected body. Nathan tried to catch her, but the blinding vapors made him stumble and fall clumsily. He wanted to throw the cloak about her again, but he was forced to gather it about him in order to make any headway at all. Miraculously, Firebird seemed unharmed by the flames. On the second floor, Nathan made out her figure hurrying far ahead of him. Her clothing was smoldering, but her bare arms and legs seemed to glow with that same inner light that he had seen back in the cave on Venus. He stumbled in the treacherous sand and lost sight of her again. He slid and fell down the first-floor stairway, which was almost burned away. His weight on it sent ominous vibrations through it, and he tried to tread lightly. Firebird was nowhere to be seen when he reached the street level. He raced outside in time to see the sand sled start up and disappear around the corner of the building. A puff of flame smashed against the sand in front of him. The enemy was watching for them to leave. That was why Firebird had moved the sled. He went back into the burning building and fought his way to a back window out of the enemy's line of fire. He found Firebird waiting for him there. The smell of smoke was in her hair, but she seemed unharmed by the flames. She gave him no time for questions. "I'm going to drive around the town. Fire every building with the rifle. That will drive him out eventually." She twisted the sled out through the narrow street to the open desert and began circling. Nathan pressed the rifle through the open port and fired continually at the wooden buildings. They watched sharply for their assailant, but he was apparently not aware of their escape. As they finished the circle, Firebird turned the sled out into the desert and swung up the far side of a high dune. "We'll watch for him to make a break for his sled," she said. "When he does, we'll let him get started and follow closely. He won't be able to fire while driving, and he won't dare stop because we'll be on him." Nathan nodded. As Firebird stopped the sled, he handed her the cloak, a mere handful of cloth. "I'd like to know what the secret of this cloak is, and how you made it through that fire without protection." Firebird smiled. "So would a lot of other people." Then she sobered and added, "I think perhaps you will be the one to know, someday." She turned away and watched the burning ghost village. It was a beautiful hell of flame. Every building was yellow with fire. The desert was lit for miles around, and the sound of the crackling was like the sound of some great battle. "He can't stay in there much longer," said Firebird. The heat was already strongly felt at the dune. "There he is!" Nathan exclaimed. A figure burst suddenly out of the inferno and ran towards the far side of the burning town. "We're on the wrong side," said Firebird. "Keep your eye on him and we'll move over if we can do it without being seen." Cautiously, through the blowholes and behind dunes, they made their way forward. The sound of their engines and propellers was muffled in the roar of the fire. They topped a rise and Nathan exclaimed, "There's his sled. He's moving." "He must think we're dead," said Firebird. "He probably plans to come back and search the ruins for the jewels when it's cooled off." She added speed to overtake the other sled. It was in sight only part of the time and it would be easy to lose in the dunes and blowholes. Nathan lowered the ported rifle and stuck the nose of the rifle through. He got a bead on the forward sled. And the instant he pressed the trigger, their own sled dipped down so that his shot went low. But it served to warn their quarry of their presence. He must have whirled to get a look at them, for the sled wobbled crazily for an instant. He dipped out of sight behind a dune and was gone when they reached the spot. Dunes blocked sight in all directions and a dozen paths branched out between them. "Over there." Nathan pointed to a fine sand cloud that betrayed the presence of the sled beyond the dunes. Firebird followed and soon they came in sight again. Nathan fired another shot that went wide because of the plunging motion of the sled. Then the enemy suddenly plunged into the depths of an immense blowhole. Firebird swung wide of the hole. Nathan glanced at her in puzzlement. "Where are you going?" Not down there. It would be fatal to get into a dogfight around the sides of that blowhole. We'll wait for him to come out and hope it is somewhere near us. From the top of a small dune they caught sight of the other sled speeding around the inside of the hole. But he knew he had failed to lure them into it, or he would have had as good chance as they. He sped up and over the edge opposite them. Firebird started the sled moving again. Nathan kept his eye on the enemy. Even as he watched, the other paused. He's not running away. He's going to turn and fight. Firebird held her speed down and let the other build up. He came in shooting. Puffs of flame spurted from the small lance he was firing through the port. Nathan raised the rifle and fired. The shot struck midway between the motor and the cabin, and the enemy sled burst into flames. "Good hit!" exclaimed Firebird. Then her face tensed. "He's going to ram us. Get his steering runner." The blazing sled was hurtling towards them at terrific speed now. It was impossible to turn aside so that the enemy could not follow easily. Firebird tried it and the other sled changed to a new collision course. Nathan fired again. Then the shot pierced their own housing as Firebird tried to weave out of the collision course. It made shooting difficult for Nathan, but he put another shot into the motor of the enemy. The blazing comet of the enemy sled was less than 300 feet away now. Firebird could have turned tail to avoid collision, but that was apparently what the enemy wanted. His own position was increasingly desperate, with the flames licking about the cabin and threatening the fuel tank. Firebird kept weaving and brought out her own lance. She tried to hit the pilot, but her shots went wild. "Stop weaving," said Nathan. "I've got to get a bead on that runner or we'll have to turn tail." "It'll be your last shot," said Firebird, but she complied. Her slim hands held the sled steadily on a course towards the flaming wreckage that bore down upon them like a meteor. Nathan raised in his seat and aimed carefully. He pressed the trigger. It was a hit. The steering runner of the enemy collapsed. The blazing sled reared end over end into the air, hurtling towards them with the force of its momentum. Firebird gave the wheel a mighty jerk and swerved aside as the wreckage plummeted into the space they had just vacated. For moments they simply drove forward without saying anything as they lost speed. "That was too close," Nathan said. "I waited too long for that shot." "You got him. That's what counts." He looked at Firebird. She was not disturbed by their narrow escape. It was obviously not in her philosophy to hold post-mortems. They swung back to the blazing wreckage. The light of dawn streaked the sky before it was cool enough to approach. There was no tangible remains of the enemy who had died in the flames. "It couldn't have been Tabor. He shoots better than that," said Nathan. Firebird poked among the embers, using the pouch containing the 4 jewels as an indicator. Then she caught the sparkle in the sands. It was the blue jewel. 9. The bloody dawn of Mars lit the ruins of them as they sped past it again. Though they had not slept, they did not feel sleepy as daylight came. Their attack and the acquisition of the blue jewel left 2 horrible alternatives in Nathan's mind. If it had been Tabor who had attacked them, surely he had not known their identity and would not have fired on them if he had. In this case, Nathan had slain his father's lifelong friend without cause. Or if it had not been Tabor, it meant that Tabor possessed the 6th jewel, the pink one, and was the murderer Nathan sought. He thrust both thoughts out of his mind and forced himself to think of the task ahead. The peaks of the Pater Mountains were not even visible on the horizon. Soon the heat of the desert they made itself felt. They switched on the air conditioning after Nathan patched the hole in the cabin housing. They ate as they drove, and in the afternoon, Firebird explained the course and they alternated driving and sleeping. Near sunset they glimpsed the distant, ominous crags of the Pater Mountains. They looked like some gargantuan graveyard where the stark bones of giants had been heaped. The wind was rising in spinning sheets of sand from the desert surface. The sandstorms of Mars are not simply the whipping, wind-driven sands of Earth. They are mighty electrical storms in which clouds of sand gather in the sky and are charged with millions of volts of potential by their ceaseless grinding against one another. It grew dark quickly with the sand clouds masking the twilight. Streamers of fire began to lace the mountain top. A continuous purple corona gave it the aspect of luminescence. The mountain rose slowly out of the desert and the sand gave way gradually to a trail of broken rocks that ground and protested against the runners of the sled. "We'll go from here on foot in the morning," said Firebird. As she brought the sled to a halt, she leapt quickly out and started tugging at a huge boulder nearby. Nathan stared in puzzlement. The boulder slowly tipped on its side, exposing a small cavern. "We'll hide the sled in here. I'll show you why in the morning." They prepared a place to sleep for the night and alternated watches. At dawn they gathered their packs of food and water and the weapons. Firebird carefully closed the cavern over the sled. She led the way along the trail that soon rose to increasing heights above the desert. They came across the burned and blackened ruins of a sand sled, destroyed with all its equipment. "That belonged to someone who came up here for the first time as well as the last," said Firebird. "There is no love lost between searchers for the 7 jewels. They burn each other's sleds when found." The corona lightning increased with terrible streamers of blue and violet light that twisted about the peaks like living things. The air was charged with ozone and Nathan felt the dry crackling of electric discharges in his hair and on his body. Firebird abruptly left the trails and struck out across the face of the mountain. Nathan followed and soon they came to a large overhanging rock. They slipped beneath the overhang and came into a narrow, half-enclosed passage. "Get behind me now and watch carefully," said Firebird. She turned and faced the opening under the overhang. "We may not have too long to wait." Nathan didn't quite understand, but he waited in silence. Beyond the opening, the rocks were gathered round to form a sort of small vestibule and nothing could be seen beyond that. But abruptly a man appeared in the vestibule. Firebird shot him without warning. "I just saved 20 lives," she said through thin lips. "Robert the dog has killed 5 innocent men that I know of. He could have been expected to kill 20 more if he had lived 10 more years." Nathan stared from the body of the dead man to the marble face of Firebird as she sat there, judge and executioner. They waited an hour and another man appeared. "She killed him, too. I've saved his mother the agony of knowing him hung for treason. The police have been ready for a month to pull him in." They waited until midday, but no one else appeared. At last Firebird turned and advanced cautiously along the passageway. Nathan felt now that killers lurked behind every stone. He didn't need Firebird's warning to keep a sharp lookout. They crept along a mile of the tortuous trail beneath the copper sky, then dipped suddenly into the blackness of a cavern. The ghostly corona that hovered over the mountain providing a faint gleam in the darkness but scarcely enough to guide them. "Take my arm," said Firebird. "I can make it in the dark." Nathan felt the tremor that was in her slight body. Some emotion beyond the grasp of his senses was surging through her. But he felt that before they left the cavern he would know what it was. After a time they came to a spiral ramp that seemed to be endless as it dropped them into the depths of the purple glow. Suddenly Firebird placed Nathan's hand on the jewel pouch. It was faintly warm. "The buried jewel?" Nathan whispered. "No, the pink one. We're still not far enough in. Your father's murderer was waiting for us somewhere inside. He's following us now." Nathan was filled with pain, for either he had slain Tabor unjustly or else he would shortly kill him to avenge the murder of his father. The ramp leveled out shortly and they made a sharp turn. Then Firebird halted. "This is where we stop. Be careful. He's behind us somewhere." "Yes, right behind you." Out of the darkness came the unmistakable voice of Tabor. Nathan whirled, reaching for his guns, but Firebird gave him a mighty shove that sent him sprawling into the corner of a deep niche in the cavern wall. "I thought you went to Venus," Nathan gasped in hate and rage. "What do you want, Tabor?" "The jewels of CHAMAR. I'm your friend and your father's friend, Nathan, but first I'm a spaceman, and the jewels of CHAMAR are above all friendship to a spaceman. Still, I'm an honorable man. I'll fight you for them, Nathan." Why didn't you just shoot us in the back as you did my father? Why will you misunderstand me, Nathan? I had to do what I did to force CHAMAR to reveal where he had hidden the jewels of Venus. He always said it was better for just one man to know that at a time. I agreed with him, but it was too bad that we didn't have the same man in mind. You dirty killer. He'll accept your challenge on one condition, said Firebird. Provided that you place the pink jewel in here in a pile with the others. You'll accept on no conditions at all, roared Tabor, if I say so. But I'd rather like to see them all together. Put them on the floor. Firebird placed the 5 jewels on the floor. The rainbow phosphorescence seemed to Nathan to be a living force that touched him with strength and with peace. From his hiding place behind a jagged boulder, Tabor threw in the pink jewel and it landed beside the others. Now, I've got something to fight for. Firebird's flame lance aimed at the point where she had first seen the glowing pink jewel. A bubble of flame exploded. Tabor's bellowing laugh ended in a roar of anger. I'd know your touch anywhere, Firebird. Your honor was born in a pig pen. Nathan tried to sense the direction of the sound. Then he aimed the rifle carefully. A ball of flame spattered upon the boulder and washed over its edges. He engraved the lighted scene in his mind. That was you, Nathan. You remember well what I told you about blackout combat. Use the rifle to illuminate the scene of battle. That is good. But do you remember what a rifle flame will do in a small space? Instantly, a rifle flame sped towards them. It blasted against the wall of the niche and flowed around in a sheet of blinding whiteness that gave off an intolerable heat before it died. Nathan and Firebird crouched low at opposite sides of the opening. We'll have to get out, she whispered. You take the right and I'll take the left, and we'll close in on him. Get behind cover as soon as possible. No. You can't risk that. It would be impossible to find cover before he illuminated you in the rifle flame. Let me try one more thing. He sent another shot higher than the previous one. It burst upon the floor far behind Tabor. Nathan got a glimpse of a distant boulder directly behind the spot where Tabor was hidden. Before he could shoot again, another blast exploded within the niche. In its light, Nathan saw that Firebird was gone. A wave of terror, an anxiety such as he had never known before, swept through him at the thought of her out there in plain view of Tabor. He aimed carefully with his small flame lance and tried to visualize the small boulder behind Tabor. The flame hit and crashed away. Tabor's voice grunted, a reflective shot. Good work, Nathan. Unfortunately, I wasn't in the plane of incidence and reflection. And, Firebird, I hear you coming. A sudden flame shot off towards the depths of the cavern at Nathan's left. There was a single agonizing scream in Firebird's voice. Then nothing. Tabor broke the silence. Sorry, Nathan. I guess you'd gone pretty soft on her. You murderer. Keep cool. Remember what I always taught you. Never let an enemy make you commit suicide by making you lose your head. The niche was like a coffin in the darkness. Tabor's evil taunting and Firebird's scream seemed to combine in an echoing song of torment that swelled and beat upon his senses. And then, in the purple darkness, the 6 jewels that lay on the floor seized his attention. Where their color had seemed merely phosphorescent before, it now seemed to blaze up as if hidden fires had come to life. Nathan watched to make sure his eyes were not merely becoming more accustomed to the darkness. But it was more than that. The light pulsed and rose in the niche. It climbed the walls and filled the air with twitching streamers that seemed like living things. And it was making him an easy target for a reflective shot from Tabor. But what did it matter what happened to him now that Firebird was gone? He fired a half-dozen shots in rapid succession. Wild, all wild, taunted Tabor. You must do it with precision. Like this. A flame shot through the niche, but it ricocheted from the edge of the opening and missed Nathan's head by only a foot. The blast seared his face and blinded his eyes. See what I mean? Said Tabor. He had the range now, Nathan knew. That's what the rifle shots had been for, to enable him to determine a good spot to make a reflective shot into the depths of the niche. but in his own wild shots Nathan had glimpsed something that gave him new hope. He had to move quickly. Another shot from Tabor grazed close to him, but it reflected from the opposite side of the opening where Tabor had miscalculated that Nathan would move. Nathan said nothing, but dropped to the floor. He adjusted the rifle to automatic fire, and lay in the opening of the niche. He pressed the trigger and a river of fire swept across the floor and flowed about the base of the boulder that hid Tabor, and under it. The boulder rested on narrow, jagged faces, between which there were openings. It was through these that Tabor had been firing, and Nathan had glimpsed the secret of his protection. The flame raced about Tabor in a torrent of light. It leapt upon him and outlined him as if in St. Elmo's fire. He jerked up in searing pain, and in that instant a single shot came from across the cavern and found its mark. The fire died before Tabor fell, but the sound of his dead body smashing to the floor was loud in the dark silence. "Your father's murder is avenged," said a voice from across the cavern. "Firebird," I thought. I had to make you think what I made Tabor think. I threw a stone to give him a target. There was no protection out here. I had only one shot to risk. Nathan rushed towards the sound of her voice, and crushed her close to him to reassure himself that she was unharmed. In the light of the jewels that was now pouring from the niche he could almost see her face. It seemed rich with gladness. The light was flickering now like auroral curtains of fire. "What is it?" murmured Nathan. "Wait, you'll see. This is what I've lived for. My work is finished now." It seemed to Nathan that they stood there for an interminable length of time while the light rose and fell, but gradually swelled until they could see each other plainly. There came a high note like the faraway tinkling of chimes. The jewels were rising from the floor. Firebird's hand on his arm restrained Nathan from rushing forward. "Wait," she commanded. The jewels rose higher and then they began to float out of the niche towards the two earthlings, carrying their ghostly light with them. Nathan stared. Where there had been only 6 jewels in the niche, there were now 7 floating in the air. 3 were end to end, forming a vertical pillar. Around this pillar the other 4 formed a rotating square. As it rotated faster or slower, the pitch of the musical note rose or fell. The singing, floating jewels came nearer, vibrating with the forces of life. And then out of the midst of them a voice spoke. "You have done well. You have my gratitude. I shall reward you." Nathan felt a prickling of the back of his neck. And suddenly Firebird clutched his arm and was sobbing faintly. "Are we too late?" she asked. "The ship of Plot has waited long, but the envoys are patient. They await my report." The jewels wheeled in the air and sped towards the tunnel ramp that bore upward to the surface. "Come," the voice said. Mechanically, Firebird followed. Nathan moved beside her, not looking back at the fallen Tabor. "What is it?" Nathan whispered hoarsely. "Are the jewels alive?"